Welcome to the Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCann.
And this is Jeremy Roth Cushel.
Jeremy, we're actually going to go a little long form today, deviate from the 58-minute format, because on our last show, we started to discuss one Arthur Finkelstein and what appears to be one of the key players in this whole quote-unquote Russiagate narrative, this long time.
Greg, hold on. There's a debate about whether it's Finkelstein or Finkelstein that started by his answer, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we'll get into the big Stein debate here in a few minutes, but this long time, very much behind the shadows, very low profile, essentially I think was a kingmaker for the right wing of the Republican Party, and not just the right wing in the United States, but also the right wing in Israel via his significant role in the 1996 election of Benjamin Netanyahu, which we'll get into later, and also even Hungary with one Viktor Orban, and we're going to be discussing Finkelstein and Hungary during the course of this show today. But we want to just go longer form and get into some of this stuff because it's very important to discuss. And we really didn't devote nearly as much time as we should have on the last show we did. So we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But I wanted to start, Jeremy, by something that just recently resurfaced on our radar just the other day. And I don't know if we ever talked about this on the show, but we noticed this a while back. It was an article that came out in 2016, I believe, before the election of Netanyahu was considering Donald Trump among a list of potential American donors to his campaign. And I believe when he became prime minister again, this would be the election probably end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And there was a list of Netanyahu potential donors, and Donald Trump was on this list. And we noticed this list about a year and a half or so ago, but with the benefit of hindsight, we found a lot of very interesting names on this list that complement Trump in the list of potential donors to Netanyahu. And Jeremy, if you want to name off a few of the more eye-catching names, we can talk about this list real quick and maybe explain the significance of some of these people being on this list and what it might mean that Trump is on a list of potential donors to the right-wing Likud prime minister of Israel.
Yes, so I'm going to be reading it. I found this one on a Ynet News article titled Netanyahu's List of Millionaires. List of potential donors prepared by then opposition leader in 2007 provides peek into his fundraising industry in the U.S. Officials include extreme rightists, people who got in trouble with law. And I guess this is prepared ahead of the 2007 primary elections. And one of the documents, which includes comments in Netanyahu's handwriting, provides a peek into his fundraising industry in the United States. The then opposition leader erased from the list people he believed would not give him money for the Likud primary elections. He divided the others into 4 categories according to whether contacting them is, quote, worth the effort, unquote. So number one category here, you read down this, you see Sheldon Adelson, Ronald Perelman, Stephen Wynn, Ronald Lauder, Tamir Sapir, Charles Kushner, Blisseth, I don't know who that is, Ira Rennert, Arnon Milchan, Nevo Vivi, Moshe Gertner, Benny Alagem, Gertler, David Bodner, Murray Huberfeld, and then in number 2 is Nasser Khalili, Rupert Murdoch, Sumner Redstone, Thomas Lee, William Davidson, Robert Kraft. Number 4, and I guess I don't know where number 3 is exactly, but Lily Safra, Joseph Safra, Moisa Safra, Steve Ballmer, Carl Icahn, Leonard Blavatnik, Eli Broad, Mickey Arison, Sam Zell, David Geffen, Leonard Lauder, Leslie Wexner, Edgar Bronfman Jr., Maurice Greenberg, he crossed out Hank Greenberg, Donald Trump, never heard of him, Chaim Saban, Mortimer Zuckerman, Henry Kravis, Ronald Arnall, someone Wertheimer, Ayal Ofer, Gerald Ronanson, Some of these I can't read in his own hand. His handwriting is sort of wild.
Yeah.
Even,
Yeah.
Tony Gelbout, Michael Siegel, Vincent Chenguis. We'll get into that.
Important.
Cliff Sobel, and then Len Blavatnik is written down again with a 2 next to his name. I guess he ranks them again in this second category here.
A couple things stick out to me about that list. Number one, maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. You'd be hard-pressed to find another name on that list that's not Jewish other than Donald Trump. His name sticks out like a sore thumb when you're looking at it from, like, say, a Jewish and non-Jewish lens. I mean, name Donald Trump sticks out like a sore thumb on a list like that. But also there were a couple of very important names. I don't think we really need to get into Ronald Lauder because we're going to get into him in a little bit. But there were one of the names that was mentioned on this list was one Tamir Sapir. And do you want to talk real quick about the significance of Tamir Sapir being on this list and his connection to Trump?
Well, I believe Sapir is part of that key Trump real estate group that's connected also with Sater, and I believe that they were part of. I don't know if Sapir was in the Bayrock group per se, but definitely part of the Trump real estate network along with Sater, with Felix Sater.
Yes,
and
I believe it was. Go ahead.
Go for it.
I believe it was Felix Sater, this guy we were just talking, Tamir Sapir, and then another guy by the name of Tevfik Arif were all, I believe they were all mentioned as doing business in Trump's Soho property in Manhattan. And what links all these people together is that they are all, Jewish, mob type figures of Russian descent or of Soviet descent.
So, for example, going back to that Political article, the happy-go-lucky Jewish group that connects Trump and Putin, that's all about the Chabad connections all the way around here, it says, starting in 1999, Putin enlisted 2 of his closest confidants, the oligarchs Lev Levayev and Roman Abramovich, who would go on to become Chabad's biggest patrons worldwide, to create the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia under the leadership of Chabad Rabbi Beryl Lazar, who would become to be known as, quote, Putin's rabbi, unquote. And I believe Beryl Lazar also has an Italian background, too. A few years later, Trump would seek out Russian projects and capital by joining forces with a partnership called Bayrock Sapir. So I guess they was hooked up, but the Sapir part of it was a separate entity that was hooked into Bayrock. Led by Soviet emigres Tevfik Arif. I guess his original name was something Arifov, and Tevfik Arif was actually a former Soviet commerce official, I believe, at some point. Felix Sater also had a different name. His father was apparently some type of lieutenant in the Semyon Moglievich Russian mob syndicate. And then Tamir Sapir, who maintained close ties to Chabad. The company's ventures would lead to multiple lawsuits alleging fraud and criminal investigation of a condo project in Manhattan. And then last paragraph. Meanwhile, the links between Trump and Chabad kept piling up. In 2007, Trump hosted the wedding of Sapir's daughter and Levayev's right-hand man at Mar-a-Lago, his Palm Beach resort. A few months after the ceremony, Levayev met Trump to discuss potential deals in Moscow and then hosted a bris for the new couple's first son at the holiest site in Chabad Judaism. Trump attended the bris along with Kushner, who would go on to buy a $300 million building from Levayev and marry Ivanka Trump, who would form a close relationship with Abramovich's wife, Dasha Zhukova.
Well, that was 666 Fifth Avenue, correct? That he just recently sold under a cloud of mystery, correct?
I'm not sure about that. I think it might have been another property in Manhattan, I think.
Okay.
But Zhukova would host the power couple in Russia in 2014 and reportedly attend Trump's inauguration as their guest. So that is Sapir. So Sapir's right in the mix there. So that what that shows also is that, as we sort of knew already, is that this network is directly tied to Israel Benjamin Netanyahu. Enough so that Benjamin Netanyahu listed Sapir as high, way up there on his list in terms of potential funders for his campaign a decade ago.
Yeah, and then I would think I want to just say real quick there were maybe three or four other names that stuck out to me. Obviously, Sheldon Adelson, and we know I think it's very well documented the Adelson role in shaping Trump's foreign policy, specifically as it relates to Israel and perhaps also to Iran. And then also the name Les Wexner was on this list. Les Wexner is the mega group member that was said to is likely the person who may have given Epstein the materials to sexually compromise political figures, and then also Leonard Blavatnik, excuse me. Len Blavatnik was on that list, and Len Blavatnik is another very significant Russian Jewish type of businessman slash criminal figure who has significant connections, I believe, to the Trump administration via I believe Steven Mnuchin. He's also considered to be close to Putin.
Yes, and I don't know how tightly Blavatnik has been tied into criminal operations. I'm just not. I don't have any background on that. I think
just a healthy assumption to make.
He's operating at a level of where everything that's actually described in Supermob, the book about how the Jewish mob in the United States figured out a way to institutionally wash its money over the long period, so that eventually it had sort of gone straight at some level. And we've talked about that before in terms of the donation by one Modalitz to the sort of washing his money through the ADL, so-called ADL. And I believe that Modalitz was a Lansky henchman, I believe. Is that true?
I believe so, and it was a huge controversy because Dalitz was just this. In many circles, he's very notorious as being a mob criminal mobster and all sorts of criminal operations. And here he is getting I believe that perhaps in exchange for his quote unquote philanthropy and donations to the Anti-Defamation League, I believe he was given what is called their Torch of Freedom Award. So
yes, and so then I would then go. Just in terms of Blavatnik, and we've mentioned it before, I would just go back to this Dallas Morning News article titled "How Putin's Oligarchs Funneled Millions into GOP Campaigns." And so also looking at this at Netanyahu's list, you begin to see, these are not just Putin's oligarchs, although they are, some of them are too, but primarily they're not Netanyahu's oligarchs. So this is from that article. Buried in the campaign finance reports available to the public are some troubling connections between a group of wealthy donors with ties to Russia and their political contributions to President Donald Trump and a number of top Republican leaders. And thanks to changes in campaign finance laws, the political contributions are legal. We have allowed our campaign finance laws to become a strategic threat to our country. An example is Len Blavatnik, a dual U.S.-UK citizen and one of the largest donors to GOP political action committees in the 2015-2016 election cycle. Blavatnik's family emigrated to the U.S. in the late 70s from the USSR, and he returned to Russia when the Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 80s. Very interesting. Data from the Federal Election Commission shows that Blavatnik's campaign contributions dating back to 2009-2010 were fairly balanced across party lines and relatively modest for a billionaire. During that season, he contributed $53,400. His contributions increased to $135,552 in 2011 and 12, and to $273,600 in 2013 to 14, still bipartisan. In 2015 and 16, everything changed. Blavatnik's political contributions soared and made a hard right turn as he pumped $6.35 million into GOP political action committees, with millions of dollars going to top Republican leaders, including Senators Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, and Lindsey Graham. In 2017, donations continued, with $41,000 going to both Republican and Democrat candidates, along with $1 million to McConnell's Senate leadership fund. Okay. Then later down in the article it says, should Blavatnik's contributions concern Mueller's team of investigators? Take a look at his longtime business associates in Russia. the oligarchs. Oleg Deripaska is said to be one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's favorite oligarchs, and he is founder and majority shareholder of Russia's Rusal, the second largest aluminum company in the world. Blavatnik holds a stake in Rusal with a business partner. Further, nearly 4% of Deripaska's stake in Rusal is owned by Putin's state-controlled bank VTB, which is currently under U.S. sanctions. VTB was exposed in the Panama Papers in 2016 for facilitating the flow of billions of dollars to offshore companies linked to Putin. And then last paragraph. Earlier this year, the Associated Press reported that Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, began collecting $10 million a year in 2006 from Deripaska to advance Putin's interests with Western governments. Deripaska's name turned up again in an email handed over to Mueller's team by Manafort's attorneys. According to the Washington Post, in the email dated July 7th, 2016, just 2 weeks before Trump accepted the Republican nomination for president, Manafort asked an overseas intermediary to pass a message on to Deripaska. Quote, if he, Deripaska, needs private briefings, tell him we can accommodate. And then it goes into Victor Vekselberg, and he and Blavatnik are longtime business partners in Rusal, with large holdings, significant holdings, over 20%. Blavatnik in 1990, Blavatnik and Vekselberg co-founded the Renova Group, so there's a lot there. We covered some of these connections back maybe more than a year ago now. Or around a year ago, I think, on an antidote. Wasn't that antidote about the sort of the fake? It was about
we discussed. You're talking about the war between Trump and the media, where we talked about the Jeff Zucker relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, and in that one we talked about. I know you read from some articles detailing Blavatnik's relationship with Steve Mnuchin, and also this big time Hollywood movie figure Brett Ratner, and who's been implicated in some Weinstein-esque scandals, I believe, and their connections through like this Rat Pack company. And so, you can go back and find our show on that, Trump and the Fake War Between Trump and the Media, I believe is the title. And I believe we discussed some of Blavatnik's connections to Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin. So.
Yes, exactly. And the shorthand for it is that as Mnuchin moves in to become Secretary of the Treasury, and probably because of emoluments issues and that kind of thing, has to divest himself likely of his holdings in the Rat Pack Dune Entertainment, a Hollywood firm. And what happens is it looks like and I think it's also James Packard, the Australian billionaire who was very close to Netanyahu, literally owned a property right next to Netanyahu, I believe, in Israel, and who's now implicated in the corruption investigation regarding Netanyahu in Israel. The combination Packard and Mnuchin divesting themselves of this Rat Pack Dune Entertainment Group, and then Blavatnik's Access Industries moves in and takes their spot in it, is I think what the shorthand was.
Well, thanks for breaking that down. You can find that in our archive when we discussed it more in depth. But needless to say, Len Blavatnik is another one of these figures. And then, of course, there were a couple more names. Arnon Milchan popped up, and I don't think I doubt it's any mystery to most of our listeners who Arnon Milchan is and some of the things he's been involved with over his decades-long career. But I think that list, is very telling. I think it says a lot about Donald Trump and not just the circles he runs around in and the people who he's connected to, but also says a lot about him that he would even be for this narrative that's been built up about Trump, that Trump is everything to everyone in so many facets of like the alternative media kind of conspiracy community. And one of the things that Trump is like he's the, he's one of the many narratives out there is that Trump is like this maverick who's going to step in and really stop like the Zion, so much of like Zionist kind of Israel dictating policy and all this and that is one of many theories that are out there. But the fact that Trump was even a figure that was even considered for financial contributions. And then, of course, about 5 or 6 years later, Trump did go on to make an ad for Benjamin Netanyahu, and I believe he was one of the only Americans. I believe it was him, and then it was Chuck Norris, the actor, making ads for Netanyahu, actually endorsing him and talking about how great of a guy he is. So I think this really speaks volumes. And as we're going to get into here in a few minutes, I think you're going to see a much bigger picture coming into play with Trump and like so many people that are connected to him, whether it's political, whether it's business, whether it's just personal acquaintances of whatever type of stripe. I think that a much bigger picture is painted here, and I think it's going to become much more. I think there might be a much bigger understanding of why someone like Trump would be considered for a list like this of one of the few Americans who's actually on the short list of political donors to Benjamin Netanyahu in the right wing in Israel.
Exactly. And I just want to mention that this figure of Oleg Deripaska is a key figure here, and especially with the Manafort trial going on right now, actually. There's a lot of questions about who Deripaska is, what are the nature of his relations, and I do believe there is a connection between Christopher Steele, the author, the MI6 author of the dossier, of the Trump dossier, and I believe, and his firm at some point had a working relationship with Deripaska. And then the other thing is, it does look like that certain people who are apparent foes of Trump, such as people like John McCain, also look like they have certain kind of relationships with Deripaska. So understanding who Deripaska is and what his relationships and networks are is probably key to understanding this larger operation.
I agree, and we'll hopefully in the future we'll find more and disclose more information on Deripaska. And I believe on this show though we've just found for this particular program. I'm glad you brought all that up. Deripaska and his donations, not just to Trump but also to people who are said to be not so much fans of Trump, like McCain and like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. This certainly needs to be analyzed, and wondering maybe what the bigger picture is with someone like Deripaska playing both it seems the pro-Trump and anti-Trump wing in a lot of ways within like the power player community of the Republican Party. So we'll leave that for further analysis in the future. But
and by the way, he wrote, I believe he wrote, you remember maybe earlier this year in the spring, he published an editorial or letter, a public letter in the Daily Caller, right, which is Tucker Carlson's
website.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
right, and what was remember the gist of that letter? I don't quite remember.
I do not remember. I think it actually did it have to do with the Trump tariffs? I can't remember.
I don't remember, but it's interesting that he chose the Daily Caller to publish that in.
Yes, and for some reason, what pops in my mind is the Putin letter, public op-ed that was organized by the firm of Ezra Cohen-Watnick's wife back in 2013.
Yes, our would-be savior in the Justice Department, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, is going to save us from the tyranny of Rod Rosenstein. Or is it Stein? Is it Stein? I don't know.
It's yeah, right. Well, we'll get into that with Finkelstein. Well, here's the article. I'll just read the title of it. The Daily Caller, Oleg Deripaska op-ed, the ever-changing, quote, Russia narrative, unquote, is false public manipulation. And it's all about how it's a wag the dog scenario, that the Russiagate is just a made up thing by the deep state, I believe, is sort of.
Sounds like Tucker and people like Hannity might be getting their talking points from little op-eds and letters like this from the likes of Deripaska. I wonder.
It's maybe.
So anyway, we've just in the last we just keep stumbling upon a number of very revealing, very well written, very extensively, exhaustingly documented articles, and a lot of these articles come from this group of researchers that I think have done very diligent work associated with the likes of Jay McKenzie, and we might get into a few McKenzie articles in a few minutes. But Jeremy, you found this article, this extremely just packed with information. I believe it was from a Reddit thread, and just a ton of information related to Russia, Alpha Bank, Cambridge Analytica. I believe Rudy Giuliani's discussed in this article. And do you want to? I think that maybe what we should do right now is maybe you can just start reading from this article, and we can comment on it as you go along.
Yeah, let's do that. And then once we hit information about this Finkelstein network, then maybe we can jump into the other background on Finkelstein and those articles.
Sounds good.
Okay, and so we'll publish the link to this. It's the thread at Reddit is Russia Logo, and this is posted by Puffin Fitness 4 months ago. Cambridge Analytica primer. Before Cambridge Analytica, prior to the formation of Cambridge Analytica, CA's parent company, SCL, was owned by billionaire Robert Mercer and Vincent Cengiz. Cengiz, a major Tory donor, was arrested in 2008 in connection with the collapse of Icelandic bank Kaupthing that lent 40% of its capital to Cengiz and his brother. Cengiz is linked both to Russia's Alpha Bank and the Ukrainian oligarch Dmitry Firtash. Prior to becoming Cambridge Analytica, SCL subsidiary SCL Elections had been involved in voter suppression in Nigeria. Birth of Cambridge Analytica. In 2013, Cambridge Analytica was born as the brainchild of Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon. At the time, Steve Bannon was executive chair of Breitbart News that was largely financed by the Mercer family. Steve Bannon met with SCL Elections at Cambridge University, prompting him to name the outfit Cambridge Analytica. Michael Flynn joins Cambridge Analytica. In 2013, the same year Bannon formed Cambridge Analytica and Trump was hanging out with the Agalarovs in Vegas and later Moscow. And by the way, I believe when Trump was hanging out with the Agalarovs in Vegas, they went to some weird bar where there was the mock peeing on people. So that's just an aside. And later Moscow, Michael Flynn would be the first U.S. officer to be allowed inside the GRU, as we spoke about a few weeks ago, where he briefed their entire staff and gave them leadership OPD. It has recently been revealed that Guccifer 2.0, who claimed to have hacked the DNC and Podesta and handed the files to WikiLeaks, is a GRU officer. And I'm going to, by the way, I'm going to be looking in a little bit to this question about these hacks, Guccifer 2.0, the question of Israeli intelligence. What's this relationship in terms of Israeli intelligence and this Russia connection here? But this is sort of the surface story there. Then, interestingly enough, in February 2014, Flynn met with a former employee of Sberbank and a graduate student at Cambridge University, Svetlana Lokova, whom had trusted access to Russian spy agency records and was writing a book about GRU spies. After the meeting, the two continued to communicate through email. Flynn would sign his emails as General Misha. Flynn did not disclose this meeting to U.S. authorities, and it's believed the incident is linked to his dismissal from the Obama administration for insubordination. So isn't that interesting, too? This is not really talked about so much, especially in relationship to think about the David Petraeus honeypot scandal when his girlfriend and biographer, who was very possibly an Israeli intelligence asset of some sort, had compromised certain security clearances in terms of materials that Petraeus was sharing with her. And Petraeus was even then I believe he was charged, and he definitely just got away with a slap on the hand. But if this is really the case, that the Flynn was dismissed from the Obama administration not because of his willingness to call out the name the Muslim rhetoric, name the Islamic terrorist rhetoric, along with his co-author neocon Michael Ledeen, but because of this potential compromised operation where he was having a sort of Petraeus type of relationship with a potential Russian military intelligence asset and was calling himself General Misha
Interesting, because the Flynn thing is important.
Greg, you're too close to the microphone. You're overmodulated.
Okay, how's this now?
Better.
Okay, sorry about that. Flynn, though, it's very interesting because you bring this up because Flynn and the whole narrative of Flynn as the whistleblower of ISIS, because basically in a lot of ways Michael Flynn was kind of the person who blew the whistle on ISIS, and I believe the big interviews he did, one, I believe it was Al Jazeera, but also RT, where he was going to blow the whistles, Clinton and Obama as ISIS. And also, in addition to that, it appears that, and I never really put two and two together on the significance of this until now, but it seems that this would be timed with Flynn, late 2014, early 2015, was doing this while he was working for and with Cambridge Analytica. Remember what one of Trump's big talking points? Clinton and Obama are the mother and father of ISIS. Was he getting that from Cambridge and from people like Flynn working on behalf of Cambridge as this whole increasingly limited hangout exposure of ISIS in the Obama administration via Hillary Clinton's creation and funding of it? So I just put that together as well.
Good point. Back to the primer. To put this meeting between Flynn and ex-Sberbank employee Lakova into context of the Trump-Russia scandal, just 4 months prior, during the Miss Universe Moscow 2013 contest, Herman Greff of Sberbank and Donald Trump signed a letter of intent for a Trump Tower Moscow to be financed by Sberbank for $1.6 billion through Crocus Group, owned by Russian oligarch Aras Agalarov. In January 2014, just a month before Flynn first met Lakova, Yulia Alferova, who hung out with Trump during Miss Universe Moscow 2013, tweeted her support for Trump's presidential run well before Trump ever announced. Flynn would eventually become an advisor for Cambridge Analytica. Some background on Flynn. Flynn ran intelligence for the U.S.-led international coalition in Kabul and was pushing for more creative approaches to targeting Taliban networks, including use of data mining and social network analysis, according to McCullough. That runs parallel to what Cambridge Analytica does. After being fired, Flynn entered into consulting, founding Flynn Intelligence Group. FIG, quote, began assembling a crew of former armed forces veterans with expertise in cyber, logistics, and surveillance, and sought out ties with lesser-known figures and companies trying to expand their profiles as contractors in the military and intelligence spheres, unquote. George Papadopoulos' ties. On Papadopoulos' LinkedIn, Papadopoulos said he wrote papers for Cambridge University, tying him into the rest of the Cambridge University spies. Papadopoulos had direct emails from both Flynn and Bannon encouraging and supporting his roles in the campaign, including his contacts with Russia. And by the way, the Papadopoulos link is a key one in terms of understanding this Russiagate, Israelgate relationship. And we've talked about, I believe, this article by John Schindler in The Observer, Kushner's old rag, and I believe he has people in his family still involved there, so that's interesting. That tells the story of how high-level U.S. counterintelligence actually believe that the Russiagate scenario is that it was Israeli intelligence making it look as though Russia, or using Russia to get the Donald Trump campaign elected. So I think that's interesting, and that the Papadopoulos part of this is that supposedly there's argument about whether it's true, but Papadopoulos was the beginning of the counterintelligence official investigation into the Trump campaign in 2016, and that it was a meeting that he had where he blurted out to an Australian diplomat that there were Russian connections with information for the Trump administration, and then it turns out that it was the Israelis who had set up that meeting in the first place. And then it comes out too that in this article that Mueller was at first was going to charge Papadopoulos with being an Israeli spy and not with the Russia connection. And use that apparently to get Papadopoulos's cooperation of some sort. So back to this article. Michael Flynn would become Jared Kushner's right-hand man. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were instrumental in pushing Chris Christie off Trump's transition team and implanting Flynn. They would later push to make Flynn Trump's national security advisor, and then pushed to have Comey fired when it was discovered Comey was investigating Flynn for lying to the FBI. Flynn was involved in many of the scandalous meetings Kushner held, including with the Prince of Abu Dhabi Zayed, Chinese Ambassador Kui Tangkai, and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Jared Kushner would ultimately order Flynn to negotiate sanctions with Kislyak during Trump's transition in violation of the Logan Act. Jared Kushner, along with Brad Parscale, worked closely with Cambridge Analytica on Trump's digital operation. Jared Kushner invited campaign embeds from Facebook, YouTube, and Google to work with his Cambridge Analytica team. So the other, I just want to mention around Comey is an important figure in all of this, and to understand why Trump had him fired, a lot is in the sort of pro-Trump community. It's that just Comey is the deep state and is just all about criminality and getting Trump out of there because Trump's going to drain the swamp. And Comey definitely is long-term national security state in the United States and definitely knows where some of the bodies are buried. And after he left the government, he was given a cushy job with as a lawyer for Lockheed Martin. While they were dealing, I believe, with some of their spy scandals that had to do with in relationship to China, actually. But it's also the case that Comey was the one who I believe who went after and investigated Mark Rich, and then was very, very angry apparently when Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich as one of his last acts in office, but then he, of course, investigated and then found that there had been no wrongdoing. And then last story on that, in terms of Mueller and Comey, is this question about who are they? Are they just deep state cover-up artists? There's definitely the de facto prima facie case is there against them, especially in terms of 9/11 and the anthrax attack in relationship to Mueller. But also, they were the ones who were there who ran to Ashcroft's bedside during the first Bush first of the second Bush administration's to try to stop the Bush administration from pushing through a re-upping of a surveillance program that they believed was unconstitutional. And then the other thing is that Mueller has been attacked by aspects of the Jewish Power press for being apparently anti-Semitic, for investigating Israeli spy rings in the Pentagon in 2004, which of course is in the direct wake of an Israeli intelligence operation, which was the operation to fraud up the intelligence to invade Iraq. That was run through Douglas Feith, the Office of Special Plans, and the OSI also, and all those were basically cells set up on the side of the Pentagon that were direct back channel, pretty much ties to Israeli intelligence, that were being used to launder false intelligence as in a parallel fashion against the majority of the U.S. Intelligence establishment that actually said that this was incorrect and that Saddam Hussein was not developing weapons of mass destruction. So there's that. I think it's a complex situation that we should look at. Any comments, Greg, or should I just keep going here?
No, keep going. I'm appreciating all the insights you're adding here. Yeah, just keep going with this article, though.
Okay, Facebook, embedded in Cambridge Analytica, is embedded by Russia. Teresa Hong from the Trump campaign says that people from Facebook, Google, and YouTube, quote, were helping us. They were basically our hands-on partners, unquote. In the video above, Teresa Hong from the Trump campaign says, quote, without Facebook, we wouldn't have won. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg has long been close with Russia. Back in 2009, Russian social media mogul Yuri Milner invested $200 million into Facebook at a valuation of $10 billion without voting rights or a seat on the board. To understand this investment, at that time, the world was going through a global recession, and Facebook's general valuation had dropped from the $15 billion from the year prior to $4 to $6 billion in 2009. Yeah, so people make a big deal about this latest dip and how Zuckerberg lost billions of dollars in personal resources as Facebook dipped over a day. But in terms of percentage-wise, they were in real serious straits, from $15 billion to the next year, $4 to $6 billion in 2009. It's not even 10 years ago, really. One company did offer a valuation of $8 billion, but with a seat on the board, which Zuckerberg was strongly against. In other words, Yuri Milner invested in Facebook when they were strapped for cash and at an inflated price without voting rights or a seat on the board. That's an amazing deal for Zuckerberg. The Paradise Papers would later reveal Milner acquired the financing through Gazprom. The deal was coordinated by Alisher B. Usmanov, a close friend of Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. A Russian oligarch himself, Usmanov earned his fortune managing steel mill subsidiaries for Gazprom. Usmanov spent 6 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement in the 80s. In 2008, Usmanov fired a publisher and editor at one of Russia's most respected newspapers after it published detailed accounts of Russian election fraud. It was said, quote, his ties to the Kremlin and Facebook have stirred concerns that he might influence the company's policies in subtle ways to appease governments in markets where Facebook is also an important tool of political dissent, such as Russia, unquote. This was in 2009. Soon after, Zuckerberg and Milner became friends, meeting monthly, and Milner even attended Zuckerberg's wedding, and guess what? Since Trump's presidential win, Facebook has been instrumental in bringing to the USA a former Russian troll of the IRA, Agatha Burdonova, and her husband, Dmitry Fyodorov, and he has even hired Joseph Chancellor from Global Science Research, the company that breached Facebook users' private data. So I'm going to keep going here. Controversial researcher Alexander Kogan partners with Cambridge Analytica. In a 2012 study, Kozinski and two colleagues at Cambridge University were able to predict any person's race, political affiliations, and sexual orientation by analyzing someone's social media activity. While at Cambridge, Kozinski met fellow researcher Alexander Kogan. Russian-born Kogan asked about using Kozinski's method for election manipulation. Quote, the whole thing began to stink, unquote, Kozinski told German Das magazine. Interestingly enough, November 2012 was when Kremlin propagandist Konstantin Rykov claims he began helping Trump's presidential campaign. In his confession posted onto Facebook shortly after Trump's win, Rykov claims he utilized Cambridge Analytica, a pair of hacker groups, presumably Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, civil journalist at WikiLeaks, political strategist Mikhail Kovalev, and, quote, the special scientific department of the Cambridge University, unquote.
Interesting you mentioned WikiLeaks there, and I think that this information is so valuable because it does show. I mean, you're getting an insight into some of the depths of just how Cambridge Analytica was able to get so much information on voters and gauge and kind of manipulate their preference, manipulate their opinions and their political biases to fit certain candidates. And it's important because, number one, I think it shows that Cambridge Analytica is certainly not what outlets like InfoWars and Alex Jones tried to dismiss it as, just being nothing significant. And also this shows that it's not just like Cambridge, Breitbart, Mercer Network, just all this. We know Breitbart was conceived in Israel, and therefore you would think the next logical step to make would be that Cambridge Analytica is largely an Israeli operation. And I think that that's largely true, but also I think it extends beyond Israel and it extends into this Russian Russian Soviet Israeli nexus, and perhaps even also in a lot of ways a global network that stretches far beyond just Israel.
Good point. And just that and this is bolded in this document. Quote, the special scientific department of the Cambridge University. And so just what flashes in my mind is, in a certain way, this is the next generation of the Cambridge spy circle.
Great point.
And what do you have there? You have Kim Philby, who we've talked about before, has his origins also as a Zionist spy. So this looks very, very similar in many ways to that more than 50 years ago.
Perhaps these aren't just all just liberal cesspool institutions, and it's much more much more complicated than the basic narratives make out to be about institutions, elite institutions like Cambridge and perhaps even Oxford, where Len Blavatnik, I believe, was on the board of, correct?
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah. And I
Some
mean,
significant people at Oxford, in the very least. They came under fire because of his support for Trump and Putin, I believe.
and so while I continue reading this, I do think that it's important to. A lot of people try to write off or dismiss the significance or the potential influence of something like Cambridge Analytica in terms of their own mind state. And I think that we should really need to rethink. And I understand the suspicion around the whole Russia narrative in relationship to pushing a new Cold War and a new McCarthyism and all of that. And I also understand suspicion around where there's a sense that the domestic intelligence apparatus of the United States that has such an obvious and blatant long history of deep disinformation programs, especially in relationship to the Cold War, and where it was all justified as basically anti-communist propaganda, and the means of domestic disinformation met the ends of defeating the evil communist empire. But at the same time, the U.S. deep state or the U.S. national security apparatus and its propaganda outfit, yes, that's an important piece, and it looks like probably that's hooked in here too in some deep way. But there's also other players, and I would just ask us to look at whether in the new age, the new cyber age of Facebook, and this way they were stripping individual data. This is not just about collective data sets, which is usually how the legacy of the way psychological operations and information warfare was run during the Cold War. It was mainly directed in large scale ways and in a macro way at groups of people, and were run through individual assets to give it a sheen of a conservative or a progressive or that type of thing. But it was not individually tuned, except for really key targets who were then had human intelligence agents or assets sent after them to specifically do it. But in this day and age, the people, all of the people, are individualized targets of these kind of mass psychological domestic propaganda operations, and increasingly with the increasing ascent of the power of especially of the foreign state in Israel, there's not even any sense of that there's not even any laws to get around in a certain way in terms of the Constitution and all of that. And so I do think we need to really pay attention to the ways that we have had our minds shaped by these individualized disinformation campaigns in ways that I think we're sort of unwilling because of our pride to quite be willing to confront in many ways, even in terms of the 2016 campaign and the talking points of if Hillary wins, then it's World War III, and it probably would not have been World War III, but it would have been the same types of ongoing drone strikes and the same type of sellout to Wall Street and the same type of sellout to Israeli hardliners. Maybe not quite as much, maybe the thing of moving the embassy would not have happened. But this is really what I think we need to understand, is that this Cambridge Analytica connection is a teaching tool in certain ways to understand what we're facing now and into the future, where with the combination of AI and augmented reality and virtual reality, the kind of psychological warfare that we're going to face is going to be intensely personal and intensely subjective and intensely convincing. And so we need to get our analytical act together now before we're facing that without any defensive tools.
No, it's a great point, Jeremy. I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that a lot of people do have a hard time grasping with the concept of they can understand how, like, and psychological operations work and things of that nature. But it's a hard time coming to grips with the idea that perhaps you yourself have been psychologically manipulated. I think I see the problem with that with a lot of people all over the political stripe. And I'm not saying we're not susceptible to it ourselves. I mean, I did for a long time. I did see Trump as like an alternative, and I bought into the narrative, if we get Clinton elected, it's going to be World War III. And while we know the Clintons are awful and we don't need to get into their history and all that, I think that, I do think that a lot of the rhetoric was weaponized, and I do think that a lot of it was exaggerated. I don't think there would have been a physical war with Russia, for example, if Hillary Clinton had been elected. I think it would have been a lot of business as usual with regards to the continuing, pushing of as far as like what is like just post-World War II neoliberal globalism. And with Trump, you actually have a rather significant shift into another element of, I think, another group of elite interests that are actually, I think that you've got a very significant shift with Trump that wouldn't have happened under Clinton. So I think that while it's important, obviously, to continue to understand that, Clinton would have been an awful choice, and we know the problems there, I think that very much exaggerate. I think these psychological warfare operations in a lot of ways did exaggerate, not just in some ways, like just magnify the crimes of Clintons while downplaying others, but also magnified this idea and this exaggeration of what would have happened under a Clinton presidency.
Yes, good point. Okay, so back to this article. November 2012 was also when Trump registered, quote, "Make America Great Again," unquote. In 2014, Cambridge University...
Stone has documented that, Trump's whole MAGA thing, and when he initially just started contemplating a presidential run at the end of 2012, so...
In 2014, Cambridge University researchers Joseph Chancellor and Alexander Kogan took the research of Cambridge University psychologist Michal Kozinski and founded Global Science Research, the company that breached Facebook users' private information and sold it to Cambridge Analytica. 2014 was a busy year at Cambridge University. It turns out the idea to scrape Facebook data through an app, however, came from Alfredas Chimilauskas, an employee of Facebook board member Peter Thiel's Palantir. An intern at Cambridge Analytica and daughter of Google's Eric Schmidt, Sophie, initially pushed Cambridge Analytica towards Palantir. And all of this all has footnotes that connect to articles. Alexander Kogan would again use his Facebook data scraping technique in 2015 on behalf of St. Petersburg State University. Kogan's lecture page at Cambridge University has since been taken down after the CA controversy erupted. Joseph Chancellor currently works as a researcher at Facebook. Ron Lauder, Trump's original Russia connection. In November 2014, the same year Kogan founded Global Science Research and Flynn founded Flynn Intelligence Group, Trump's childhood friend Ron Lauder met with Mikhail Friedman and German Kahn, both of Alpha Bank in London. 2 years later, in April 2016, Ron Lauder would meet with Vladimir Putin. I just want to point out that Mikhail Friedman and German Kahn of Alpha Bank, that German Kahn's, I believe it's his son-in-law, who's a van der Zwijs. He's a van der Zwaan. He's a Dutch citizen, I think. Maybe he's a dual national. I don't know. I believe he was already indicted by the Mueller investigation, and it was for work that he was doing while he was at the law firm of Skadden Arps, which I've mentioned before, which people should go look at as an epicenter of people connected to the post 9/11 payoffs of the family members. So there's a whole connection there in terms of Skadden Arps. And then also I floated the idea that Skadden Arps, in terms of it being probably the go-to law firm in the entirety of the United States of America for Israeli technology companies, is probably the epicenter domestically of things like the legal arm of the Top Yacht program and the Israeli long-term global cyber domination project. So that's what's implicated in all of this, too, I believe. So 2 years later, in April 2016, Ron Lauder would meet with Vladimir Putin. Alpha Bank servers would later directly ping servers from the Trump Organization and Betsy DeVos's Spectrum Health. Betsy DeVos's brother, Eric Prince, has a business associate, Ko Chun-shun, on the board of Cambridge Analytica. Ron Lauder has a long history of connections with Russia. As a matter of fact, Trump's first known introduction to a Russian government official was to Russian Ambassador Yuri Dubinin at a luncheon hosted by Ron's brother, Leonard Lauder, in 1986. Ron Lauder is close to Alfa Bank's Peter Oven. They both sit on the board of Patrons Together, host art galleries together, and Ron Lauder's Lauder Institute joined Alfa Bank in awarding foreign firms that conduct successful business in Russia. Who so happened to be on the jury for that award? Trump advisor and Alfa Bank chair Richard Burt. Ron Lauder, and by the way, I think it's one of, I think it's Mikhail Friedman, or it's one of them or Abramovich, one of them who's the guy who's behind the Genesis Award in Israel, the so-called Jewish Nobel Peace Prize or something like that.
I believe it's Mikhail Friedman, actually.
So that's, there you go, and so that's interesting too that you have what's her name, the actress who.
Natalie Portman, who's really been a long-term, I think she's actually Israeli. I think she grew up in Israel early on, and that she's been a long-term advocate for Israel, but she was unwilling to stand on the stage with Netanyahu, which I think shows some of this potential split that we've shown before between this old school group of American Jews and neocons who were definitely Israeli partisans, but there's a sort of growing obviousness about this connection to this Russian connection and this multipolar so-called shift to the east and Israel's deeper and deeper connections with Putin's Russia. And China, by the way, too, of course, and so that they want their power at home in the known power poles of Jewish power in the United States of America, including D.C., L.A., and New York, and they are suspicious, I believe, of this shift to this deeply Russian group connected to Netanyahu. But that's just my observation. I agree.
Ron Lauder has done business with Russian oligarchs Lev Levayev. Lev Levayev, of course, by the way, is the new blood diamond billionaire in many ways, and has replaced sort of the older school people. And as we pointed out before, he's also deeply Chabad connected, one of the biggest funders globally. Ron Lauder has done business with Russian oligarchs Lev Levayev and Oleg Deripaska's business partner Roman Abramovich, the same Lev Levayev whom Jared Kushner did business with and whose luncheon he met Ivanka Trump, and the same Roman Abramovich whose ex-wife Dasha Zhukova is good friends with Ivanka Trump and suspected Chinese agent and Putin love interest Wendy Deng, who is, by the way, I believe Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife, I think.
Yeah, Wendy Deng, yes. Rupert Murdoch, indeed.
So this exact network here really shows this is a global network, an intelligence conspiracy that transcends national borders in many ways and includes aspects of the United States very obviously too.
Yeah, and when we get into Arthur Finkelstein here in a few minutes and some of his political history, I think I might talk a little bit about just the misleading narrative on what makes a pro-Israel partisan and what makes a conservative, say, hawk that's devoted to Zionism. We can get to that in a few minutes, though. But I'm glad you bring all this up because this is a very, very extensive network of very influential people.
In 1998, Lauder joined George Nader and Benjamin Netanyahu in secret Israel-Syria negotiations that ultimately failed. George Nader is close to UAE Crown Prince Zayed and was instrumental in arranging a meeting between Eric Prince and head of the Russian direct investment fund Kirill Dmitriev. Even today, Lauder sits on a board with Yuri Milner, the Russian oligarch behind DST's investment into Facebook. Ron Lauder, with the help of Trump Organization employee Arthur Finkelstein, I think Stein, he wanted it, ran for New York City mayor in 1989, though he failed to gain the nomination. Lauder would later recommend Finkelstein to Benjamin Netanyahu. Since 2003, Finkelstein partnered with George Birnbaum, who would become enmeshed in the campaigns of pro-Russian Netanyahu and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, eventually joining Ben Carson's campaign, where George Papadopoulos got his first campaign experience. And then, after Carson's campaign collapsed, Birnbaum moved on to join Ben Carson's ex-campaign manager Barry Bennett and Trump's ex-campaign manager Corey Lewandowski to form Avenue Strategies. And before you get all into this, I just want to mention again that all these figures are covered in John Swinn's infographic about Lauder Finkelstein network that we will also link to, and they're all here, including Birnbaum and Finkelstein and Orban, Trump, Netanyahu.
Okay. It's interesting. We are going to start talking more long form here about Arthur Finkelstein in a minute. That whole thing with the Lauder Giuliani '89 mayoral campaign in New York. It's interesting because you mentioned to me that Roger Stone pretty much learned the art of like elevating these political operations that involve perhaps fake opposition from someone like Arthur Finkelstein, and this would fit in the realm of something like that because, Lauder and Giuliani, two people who I think have very close and very, in large parts, identical agendas in a lot of ways. I mean, was that, I just wonder if that was a legitimate, like, election race, or if that was, I don't know, but it's interesting if you look at the art of perhaps like a manufactured campaign.
Yeah, like in this infographic by John Swinn under Roger Stone, it says political dirty tricks operative GOP, protege of Roy Cohn and Arthur Finkelstein, partner of BMSK lobbying firm with Manafort and Atwater, and talks about his key role in all of these things in the campaign. So it is really interesting that Roy Cohn is sort of known and emphasized at times by certain elements of the media, alternative media, and analysts. But Arthur Finkelstein is really, even after he's apparently died, he continues to be a sort of a specter and stayed off of the grid in many people's awareness grid. I can also just real briefly read what John Swinn has listed under this Arthur Finkelstein, Merchant of Venom. Key strategist and mastermind behind Benjamin Netanyahu's successful 1996 election campaign, GOP mastermind that played a significant role in Trump's campaign, mentor of lifelong friends of Trump, Roger Stone, and Paul Manafort, introduced Manafort to Putin's pro-Russia Ukrainian oligarchs, was openly homosexual and married to a man before his death, and by the way, was working with Jesse Helms, right, and people were trying to pass anti-gay laws, and right, and at the same time,
Jesse Helms would be like the epitome of like the of who like would be brought up by the left as being the quintessential kind of bigoted, anti-gay, bigoted Republican. And Arthur Finkelstein, as we might get into here, or Stein, however you pronounce it, played a very major role in the continuation of Jesse Helms' political career when he ran into problems. I believe that that Arthur Finkelstein most likely looks like the missing piece that was not mentioned in the Walton Mearsheimer's book on the Israel lobby, where they document Jesse Helms moving from being more of a, kind of more of a foreign policy skeptic, so to speak, not really caring so much about the Israel issue, to becoming a very hawkish pro-Israel supporter in the Senate. And so I think what this points out is that both Roy Cohn and Arthur Finkelstein was notoriously secretive. He was very low-key, never was on the record. I don't think ever did interviews. Both of these men were notoriously very well known as being homosexual, gay, Jewish men, and they both were very much promoting of candidates and of people in general who were very anti-gay, as far as at least in their public rhetoric. And Jesse Helms would fit into that. And I think, and so I can make a few more points to that here in a minute if you wanted to say something else about that, bro.
Well, I think there's a parallel there in terms of the way that we've begun to research this aspect of the Hungary connection and also the alt-right Israel first connection, the Zionist Nazi connection, if you might put it like that too, where there's obviously some type of what I would say again is a Jewish power pincher move or a Jewish power dialectic that appears to be very, very comfortable within a hypocritical on the surface way to work with apparently the enemy of your kind of person, whatever it may be. And it shows that there's a political program here that's front and center, way that in a certain way, in the similar way that the real hardcore neoconservatives believe that religion is only they're sort of marks, but they see it in a positive way, that it's the proper opiate for the masses. That people like Finkelstein and his whole crew of children, or boys as they call them, believe that identity politics is really the opiate for the masses, or the opiate for the realpolitik.
Yeah. And, Finkelstein, I think is a perfect example of just the, understanding someone like him and just even like the basic history of what he was involved with in terms of political operations in the U.S. and the right wing in Europe. He was close to Viktor Orban, to the point that Orban referred to him as Finky, I believe. That's very sweet, by the way. And then Israel and his primary role in Netanyahu getting elected in '96. You start to realize that this narrative that has been very carefully constructed in the alternative media of the neocons, the conservative, the Republican hawks, right? The ones who are real hawkish, and that the roots of their hawkishness is all about Israel. And I think there might be much bigger than that. I think there's much more of a global emphasis than just a strictly Israeli emphasis when it comes to the hawkishness of people like your Bill Kristols and your David Frums, for example. But this narrative is that, the neocon conservative hawks who are all real heavy Zionists, they're all just descendants of the Bolsheviks. And of course, when you think of Bolsheviks, you consider the people who obviously were responsible for the death of the Shah, sorry about that, the Tsar and his family in Russia in 1917, and the deaths of millions that followed, of course, in Soviet Russia. And you identify that with the left, for example, and with not just the left, but the extreme kind of communist left. And these are the usurpers who are into the Republican Party. They're trying to destroy the conservative nationalist movement, right? Well, when you get a glimpse into people like Finkelstein, and also not just that, but even this long arching political network that runs through operations such as Breitbart and even many other Zionist media operative or outlets here in the West, and you get this bigger picture that it's not really Trotskyite Bolsheviks who are pushing the real hardline Israeli policies that are in line with all this religious stuff. But it appears to me that these are the long-term descendants, perhaps ideological descendants of the original hardline Zionist movement, which would be perhaps your Jabotinskyites, people who were very much, I think, critical of this global Bolshevik movement. And I think a lot of this may be at the root of the famous Winston Churchill article we've talked about before, Zionism versus Bolshevism, a battle for the soul of the Jewish people. And here you've had this long-term willingness to work with these right-wing, European Western nationalists and advance policies. And I think even a country such as Hungary, I think, is very, very much fits into this, because Hungary is one of the countries that is most identified with resistance to Soviet communism. And you have people like, of course, Sebastian Gorka, my family fought both the communists and the Nazis, so don't call me an anti-Semite. And this is a perfect epitome of not only is the whole idea that Zionism and hawkishness in terms of Israel and foreign policy in general is rooted in this Bolshevik clique that kind of usurped the traditional right wing. But it not only is it that, but these people that we're talking about here, that we're identifying, these, in the spirit of like your Arthur Finkelsteins and others, that these people are not only are they not I don't believe are Bolsheviks. I believe that people like Roy Cohn were probably may have been very sincere in their anti-communism, but also they're very willing to work with the direct antithesis of this, the Irving Kristol style ex-Bolsheviks turned conservative hawks, and that they're willing 100% to forge these alliances with these ultra nationalist right wingers in Europe, who, in a lot of ways, their policies and their ideologies run very, very contrary to this more global kind of globalized outlook in terms of just pushing these globalized policies.
Yes, a good point. And I'm going to just continue just reading the last half of these points that's on Swin's infographic here. Along with business partner George Birnbaum, began advising Orban in 2008. Formed a UK consulting firm with a top advisor of Viktor Orban, Arpad Habony, based close to WikiLeaks. And although we're not going to have time to get back into it, we mentioned these articles that were printed in the Hungarian Free Press, the Budapest Bridge articles. And I just want to point out in there that those connections are covered in that a little bit. But in the epilogue, in the sort of third one of those articles, the author makes a connection between Bannon's understanding of the idea of chaos magic warfare, meme magic warfare that was so highly connected and behind the social dynamics of the Trump campaign, to John Grinder and Richard Bandler's book, The Structure of Magic. And I believe maybe Bandler or maybe both of them are the sort of the fathers of neuro-linguistic programming, which has a deep connection to aspects of the U.S. intelligence community, including the sociologist, I'm forgetting his name, who basically helped start MK Ultra, but it's basically I think that's in the.
It's not Cameron, is it?
No, I'm thinking of he was married to Margaret Mead, actually.
Okay, never mind.
I can't remember his name. But look up Margaret Mead's husband, who was an OSS operative and then a social psychologist of some sort. But I think that's in the background in many ways behind the Cambridge what's implied by Cambridge Analytica, Palantir, and the future of psychological warfare, cyber psychological warfare, is things like neurolinguistic programming. And I think I've mentioned it before that these phrases, the imagery and the phrases that the Trump campaign used was not only tested years before, very likely, but it also is used because it has this magical psychological element, this neurolinguistic programming element to it. So I just wanted to mention that because I don't think we're going to go back into that. I think
an institution like Cambridge would be perfect with implementing things like that too.
Yes. Exactly. So should I read a little bit from these articles on Finkelstein?
Yeah, let's see if we can get into a little bit on I'd like to get into just what he did with regards to Israel and Netanyahu, and then let's just you can just if you have some articles ready to read, we can just go through them and then comment on them as we go along.
Okay, we'll work back from the president and read just a little bit from this Politico article from April of 2016 titled "Sheldon Adelson and Top GOP Donors Retreat to the Sidelines. Ambivalence about a Trump-Cruz battle pushes many Republican fundraisers away from the presidential contest." Dispirited over a Republican Party primary that has devolved into an ugly, damaging fight, some of the GOP's biggest financiers are reevaluating whether to invest in the 2016 presidential contest at all. Among those on the sidelines, Sheldon Adelson, the billionaire casino mogul who hosted the Republican Jewish Coalition's spring meeting at his Venetian hotel this weekend, his apparent ambivalence about 2016 was shared by many RJC members here. With grave doubts about the viability of the few remaining Republican contenders, many of these Republican donors have decided to sit out the rest of the primary entirely. And while some are reluctantly getting behind a remaining candidate, others are shifting their attention to congressional contests. On Friday morning, during a meeting of the group's board, Arthur Finkelstein, iconic, sorry, I misread that. An iconic Republican strategist who has advised numerous politicians over the past 4 decades, presented polling data that showed Donald Trump sitting at historically low approval numbers among American Jews, according to 3 attendees who described the off-the-record meeting. Ted Cruz, despite an aggressive recent push to court Jews, fared little better. So I just wanted to bring that in to show that Finkelstein was not only involved with the Trump campaign specifically, but that he was actually helping organize the background of the Jewish power operating through the Republicans from pretty early on there, and you could almost intuit that he was the one who helped smooth the transition with the GOP apparatus to accepting this Trump insurgency.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it also shows that it wasn't just Trump that there was trepidation about. There's also very much, I think, a fear within a lot of the Jewish community in America, which does more or less tend to be more socially liberal, in terms of supporting the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. There's also a lot of fear over Ted Cruz. So I think. You have your operatives like Finkelstein who were working to, I think, assuage a lot of perhaps the doubts about Trump and Cruz, while also perhaps finding ways to make these candidates more appealing. And we see, I think, in the case of Trump, it probably worked, at least with the right-wing Jewish Zionist population in America. I believe he won the Orthodox communities in New York by a total of, I believe it was, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe by an almost percentage of close to 10-1 over Hillary Clinton. So I think it worked at some level. And what I think this also shows is that, you had your people like Finkelstein maybe helping to deliver and to maybe influence the message in terms of the way it's going to these high-profile Jewish donors. Is that what I think it showed is that while you have this type of Cambridge type of operation and these operatives working, I think within both the Trump and Cruz campaigns, and obviously Trump was eventually chosen, I think, as a better candidate for this particular agenda than Ted Cruz was. I think that with the role of the Finkelsteins, I think it may have been much easier with someone like Finkelstein there to get people like the Adelsons to shift their support behind Trump. And you also have the operatives in place to ensure that someone like Adelson and these hardline Zionists get their goals put in place when it comes to Israel, as that was documented, that there were very significant, I think, deals made as far as like certain elements of Israeli policy and Sheldon Adelson's support of Trump. So.
Yes, and so then maybe I'll move to this National Review article that you pointed out that really talks about the background here of Finkelstein. Not just good at national politics, but the best, by Craig Shirley, January 26, 2017. Shunning the limelight, the legendary GOP consultant Arthur Finkelstein changed the world. Good morning. Each time we speak by phone, I hear this slightly amused and amusing lyrical greeting in Arthur's distinctive Jewish Brooklyn accent. I have for 40 years, no less. So has everyone else who has ever dealt with Arthur J. Finkelstein, simply the greatest and most controversial, the most ethical and most successful political consultant and pollster in the history of American politics. So obviously, by the way, this is a laudatory, a sort of an iconography, of a hagiography of Arthur Finkelstein, basically. Those who matter in politics are familiar with Arthur, but no one beyond that, which is the way Arthur likes it. He's never been the face of a wristwatch, but the gears would not run without him. While other consultants run to the spotlight, Arthur has always run away from it. Quote, if you haven't heard of him before, it's because he made sure you didn't, unquote. He was once described in a profile in the Huffington Post I'm going to skip down a little bit. Long before anyone else in the modern age, Arthur taught Republicans how to win. At one point in the early 1980s, maybe half of the GOP senators were Finkelstein's clients, and even more in the House. He was a modern Prometheus bringing fire to the Republican kind. He greets all alike, and they certainly are many, from the lowliest campaign aide to prime ministers and presidents. As always, Arthur is supremely confident and yet often shy and self-effacing. Truth be told, he is also a soft touch. Once, when a losing campaign reneged on its pledge to pay for an airline ticket, one of Arthur's, quote, kids, unquote, called him, desperately broke. Arthur paid for the ticket. Such stories are legion. So then this is a tribute. He's struggling through chemotherapy now, and that's why they're writing this. Early in our friendship, I asked him whether it was Finkelstein or Finkelstein with a long I, and Arthur characteristically replied, quote, if I was a poor Jew, it would be Finkelstein, but since I am a rich Jew, it's Finkelstein, unquote. He'd plucked me out of an NCPAC, National Conservative Political Action Committee campaign school in 1977, and we've been friends, and he's been my mentor ever since.
It's funny because that's almost like playing into, I think perhaps maybe even Finkelstein is playing into stereotypes about, Jews and wealth, and Stein is the more stereotypical Jewish name. So if he has money, he becomes a Stein, which I think is a much more kind of stereotypical Jewish name than, say, Steen is.
He abhors being called Art, and those who don't know him, when they make that mistake, will be met with that sardonic grin on his face. In the maturation of his libertarian philosophy, think Roger Stone pitching himself as a libertarian, basically. Yeah.
And this even makes me wonder about people like, going back in the past, people like, not just people like Ron Paul's mentor, Rothbard. It makes me even wonder about people like that. Anyway.
Yes. Okay, let's... So in the maturation of his libertarian philosophy, he had the best educator in the world while at Columbia, Ayn Rand, with whom he sometimes shared a college radio show. Wow. After graduating, he later cut his teeth in polling, working for the legendary Bud Lewis at NBC, and later still for the famed Richard M. Scammon, who was the only pollster to predict the election of Harry Truman in 1948. Which, of course, by the way, we know that Truman election was very deeply involved with the production of millions of dollars of Zionist money that was run through parts of the B'nai B'rith networks, but also, I forget, there's a guy who's FBI Feinberg, Abraham Feinberg, I think his name was, who ultimately also became a key American operative in the Israeli nuclear program transfer of I believe probably to actual technology, and so he was key to that. And there's a FBI file that's recently been put out.
Oh man,
on
so
him.
you would tell me that Truman's election wasn't a miracle by God? Darn.
No, and it was the ultimate, as I pointed out before, it was the ultimate mob. Besides being a 33rd degree Freemason and having set up the CIA and having used the nuclear bomb, Truman was the year before his recognition of Israel. And it's interesting, this conjunction in temporality of the construction of the institutionalized U.S. national security apparatus with the National Security Act and the CIA, and the birth of the state of Israel. And that in the year before Truman recognized Israel, he was sent these letter bombs, these mail bombs by the Stern Gang, which were the most fascist, openly fascist of the Zionist militant terrorist groups in the years before the birth of Israel. And so he was basically given that old mob choice between the lead or the silver. And so at the same time as he was having mail bombs sent to him as the threat, he was also being offered the carrot by the Abraham Feinberg network of the millions of dollars delivered in a suitcase to his campaign when he really, really needed it. And then go for it.
Go ahead.
Well, just the last thing I was saying is that this idea of the pollster is really, really important to all of this. That the pollster is in many ways the proto Cambridge Analytica. This was Cambridge Analytica before it was all based on actual Facebook individualized data. And we've talked about before John McLaughlin, who was the Trump pollster who came directly out of a working relationship in Israel with Netanyahu to the Trump campaign, who is one of Finkelstein's kids, as they say, or whatever they call them.
The other one is Frank Luntz, who in a lot of ways, Frank Luntz may be the best example of Cambridge Analytica without the ability to data mine. I mean, you look at some of the things that Frank Luntz has done over the years. He's another one of Arthur Finkelstein's children. And I was going to say real quick before we move on, I was talking just now about Ron Paul's mentor, Murray Rothbard, and that whole kind of Jewish libertarian paleo conservative network, so to speak. And you mentioning Arthur Finkelstein doing this college radio with Ayn Rand. I think that's very significant because you're seeing here with this kind of this Jewish libertarian that will play a lot of will play both libertarian as far as being anti-statist and all this and that, but also being like these libertarian live as let live, but at the same time having this serious push within like the ultra right wing community. I think we're seeing a pattern forming here with, I think, what historically may prove to be a very controlled nature of this kind of this Jewish, very Zionist heavy libertarian faction that I think has produced a lot of your Ron Paul types over the years.
It's a good point, especially since there's this background split, supposedly, right? Of Ron Paul as the perfect example of the libertarian idea. Rand, his son, Ayn Rand, and they're set up against the neocons. But I think it is interesting that there may be a lot more deeper commonality here, and there's even what's her name? Ayn Rand. I think she was born Alyssa Rosenbaum. She was a Russian Jew, which is also the background of a lot of the neoconservatives and their family. And even politically, they sort of come right from being Trotskyites and all of that. But Ayn Rand is an anti-communist and individualist of some sort. But I think it's pretty interesting if we go back even to thinking about the role of like the John Birch Society as an anti-communist, and then putting that together with this sort of like constructed dialectic of choose Bolshevism or Zionism, and you see, I think, the playing into that kind of managed dialectic between even the roots of Ayn Rand's libertarianism and the modern neoconservatives.
And even someone like, and I'm going to make this quicker so we should move on, but even someone like Murray Rothbard, who was a big-time kind of libertarian mentor to, I believe, the Paul family, Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and of course Ayn Rand is who Rand Paul's named after, but even someone like Murray Rothbard would be very critical of U.S. foreign policy, but would also be, I believe I can find these links, I'd have to go back, I believe, on Lou Rockwell's website, archived articles by Murray Rothbard, where he's opposing issues like civil rights legislation based on individualism, and also I believe was even somewhat supportive of one David Duke when he was running for office in Louisiana. So there's certainly a lot of playing both sides of this, because the anti-civil rights stuff will cater to the the paleo conservative crowd, and even the kind of lip service to opposing a lot of U.S. Foreign policy moves. But also at the same time, though, you're not really doing anything to counter like this extreme Zionist sect at the same time. So I find that very interesting. And once again, Finkelstein would be very much epitomize a lot of these type of thinking, minus like a lot of the paleo conservative criticisms of foreign policy. But even that, as we mentioned, with Ron and Rand Paul being kind of pushed as like on one hand like the anti kind of pushing back against some of like the hardline foreign policy rhetoric, but also being like a defender of Trump on things like Russia and fighting the deep state. I think you are seeing a very much a bringing together of both of these different sides here.
Yeah,
historically.
And for example, in an American conservative article titled "Objectivist for Empire" that we'll list in a paragraph down, it says, appearing on the Phil Donahue show in '79, Rand was asked what she thought of U.S. policy in the Middle East. This is after talking about how she was a non-interventionist. She was against the intervention in Vietnam. She was against World War II in many ways. She replied that the American government should side with Israel against Palestinians because, in her words, Israel was, quote, was the advanced technological civilized country, unquote, in the dispute, squared off against, quote, a group of almost totally primitive savages who have not changed for years and who are racist and who resent Israel because it is bringing industry and intelligence and modern technology into their stagnation, unquote. And so that almost reminds me of like the Sam Harris line on this. And yeah, I don't like the religious connotation of Israel, but they're clearly the civilized over the savages in Palestine.
And even someone like Ron Paul, who I give a lot of credit for a lot of the things he said about Israel, he's even made comments alluding to Israel running an open-air concentration camp in Gaza. Even Ron Paul, he was, may have been his libertarian live and let live philosophy. I support, I don't have a problem with the embassy being moved to Jerusalem because basically he would almost frame it like the libertarian. It's not America's business. But also what that does is, I think it either intentionally or unintentionally on the part of someone like Ron Paul gives by not addressing the issue of just the power of Zionism in America, gives, I think, a lot of these people an opening and gives them I think, provides a lot of cover to even have someone like Ron Paul put a statement like that out, because as long as you don't address even the issue of just the extent and depth of Zionism and its power and control over so many aspects of our country, I think you're seeing that's another example of just playing the sides here, where you do have this perhaps very principled opposition to so much of our foreign policy, but also at the same time, though, my libertarian philosophy is going to drive me to support this for Israel. If only America got out of Israel's business, it would be okay. And one of Ron Paul's big talking points, I think that gives a cover for a lot of this, because it's not addressing the power of Zionism and using libertarianism as a cover to say, well, Israel can do what it wants as long as America's not involved. That becomes a problem when you consider the power of Zionism in America.
I'm just thinking, too, when I was confronting Michael Glassner and John McLaughlin after the election, I asked Glassner, after I brought up the Epstein issue with Trump and Trump's public statements about Epstein, I asked, is this a Netanyahu operation? And in looking back, I should have asked both him and McLaughlin about whether this was a Finkelstein operation, because it obviously is a Finkelstein operation, and because Finkelstein's the one who helped put Netanyahu in power in many ways.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so you only have probably a few minutes left here, Greg. But should I read a little bit more down on this article and then we'll wrap it up?
Yeah, go for it. Read a little more down this article, and I know we both kind of digressed a little bit, but I think that's okay. And I think if you want to read some more from this article, that'd be great.
Okay. Arthur would sell his soul before going on Fox News or MSNBC, where most GOP consultants are found today. Arthur would rather work in the trenches and win a campaign than pose as a celebrity consultant, going on cable television and talking about winning campaigns. Prior to Karl Rove's whiteboard, Arthur was often seen taking a pencil from behind his ear to scratch out political theories, ad concepts, speech concepts, and other ideas on a yellow legal tablet. Long before people were talking about three-legged stools and other such tomfoolery, Arthur had developed the more thoughtful six-party theory. This six-party theory originated in the 1970s as a means to explain how Republicans could attract Democrats through conservative ideology and win a majority. Conservative Democrats were the key. Conservatives outnumbered liberals roughly 2-1. The six parties broke down as moderate liberal Republicans, conservative Democratic theocrats, which were mostly Southern and blue-collar, African Americans, Hispanics as one group, white liberal Democratic McGovernites, and moderate Democrats. When he explained it, it made perfect sense. His ability to condense a difficult theory into layman's words was but one of the ways that he showed his genius. The grand
Makes you wonder makes you wonder if Finkelstein, perhaps the depths of his role in like the Southern strategy, which famously used racial dog whistles to basically convert the South from being heavily Democratic to heavily Republican, makes you wonder what his role in that is. And of course, we've found some areas where he was involved in Reagan's 1976 campaign as kind of the conservative populist. So that makes me curious about that.
Yes. So I'm going to keep going down here into this article. Okay, let's skip the Jesse Helms part. We've already sort of mentioned that's there. There's the whole issue of his role in helping be the one who helped promote Reagan originally. And people, again, if they understand what that means, they should go look at the book Super Mob that describes the California armed Jewish mob's role in making Reagan their man in many ways. So
people like Lew Wasserman, the Hollywood mogul.
Exactly. So then it goes into D'Amato, Alphonse D'Amato. I'll read some of this. This is after the 1976 when Reagan lost in the GOP Kansas City event. By the way, Arthur later that year did the same in Texas, where Reagan trounced Ford, winning all 96 delegates. Finkelstein changed our world. Finkelstein, sorry, he's a rich dead Jewish guy. About using D'Amato's mother in a commercial, Finkelstein quipped to John McLaughlin, "We had to prove Alphonse had a mother," unquote. Arthur did all of Helms' campaigns and created the permanent campaign before the phrase was coined, using Helms' congressional club to boost the senator and bury his opponents. But he was never just an order taker. He argued vociferously that Helms should stop his opposition to a federal holiday honoring Martin Luther King Jr. After one tussle, Arthur emerged and said to John McLaughlin, quote, "We won't budge, thinks King was a communist," unquote. And then in a burst of dark humor told him, quote, "You've really got to be an extremist and not want a day off," unquote. And then it goes back further into D'Amato. Okay, 96. Arthur handled the campaign of Bibi Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel. Again, history was made. Without the election of the Israel now and forever, that was the slogan, hardliner Netanyahu, would Israel even exist today? Just to prove that it was no fluke, Arthur steered him to further victories. For the past 20 years, in addition to his work in the U.S., he has expanded his portfolio to include winning campaigns in Kosovo, Austria, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Israel, where he guided Ariel Sharon to victory twice. I asked him what his greatest source of pride was and his greatest disappointment. Without missing a beat, he said that writing the immortal words at the base of the 9/11 memorial in New York City gave him the greatest satisfaction. Quote, "To honor and remember those who lost their lives on September 11th, 2001, and as a tribute to the enduring spirit of freedom," unquote. To know Arthur is to know at heart he is a romantic. He has always seen campaigns and his life as an idealistic struggle for liberty against the dark forces of collectivism. Globalism, collectivism, right? The individualists and the Ayn Rands. Okay. His biggest disappointment was a campaign in Massachusetts 40 years ago because the candidate had a chance and was much like Arthur in his political outlook. He still laments that loss. Arthur is also the greatest collector and cultivator of political talent in the history of the GOP. Some of his, quote, kids, unquote, over the years have included the aforementioned John McLaughlin, Jim McLaughlin, John Hubush, and Carter Wren, but also Mary Massingwell, Charlie Black, Roger Stone, Tony Fabrizio. And you pointed out, Greg, that Charlie Black is the Stone, Manafort, and Black of the dictators lobby, right? Or whatever they were called.
Yes.
Zorine, Bapu Shirley, Gary Maloney, Alex Castellanos, Castellanos, Rick Reed, Kieran Mahoney, Barbara Fiala, Craig Engel, Frank Luntz, Jim Murphy, Beth Myers, Larry Weitzner, Matt Brooks, Ari Fleischer, Terry Dolan, and Brent Bozell, to name just a few. There's always been a certain swagger among Arthur's kids, as they knew and understood politics better than anyone else. At least they believed that. The few who traveled with Arthur became known as Little Arthurs. It was all great fun, but it was also to a larger purpose. We believed we were saving Western civilization. Check that. We knew we were saving Western civilization, and we were fearless, as we'd been taught by Arthur. There was always an allure to being one of Arthur's kids. And okay, so then that's pretty much it, and it just is just a good luck and Godspeed, Arthur. I can't imagine a world without Arthur J. Finkelstein. And Greg, you saw in Haaretz as a tribute, right, to Arthur Finkelstein after he died, that there was some type of, what was the title of the article? Something about the man who helped.
I believe it may have been one of the other Israeli publications, maybe the Times of Israel or Jerusalem Post, but it described, and I believe in the title, I believe it was trumpeting his role in Netanyahu's election. Is that correct?
Yes.
Basically, almost describing him as like maybe the man who got Netanyahu elected more than anyone else, with the campaign he came up with for Netanyahu, playing on fears that Shimon Peres would divide Israel would divide Israel and give away our land to the Palestinians, and even almost pushing like this is a battle of life and death for the state of Israel. And so I'd have to find that article, but I think it may have been Times of Israel, and it was definitely trumpeting Finkelstein's role as like the key guy in getting Netanyahu elected for the first time.
And so then you would just go look on his Wikipedia page, and there's all of this and more on there, which is very interesting now. It's almost like I think it's somebody saying, screw you, Finkelstein, everyone's going to know about what you did at this point. I don't know, maybe not, maybe it's a bragging thing. But some of his quotes, for example, a crook always beats a fool. Quote, when you allow people to choose between the corrupt and the stupid, they will go for the corrupt. Said in reference to a 2003 Israeli campaign. That's why Trump's always making fun of people's being stupid, right? Because he's a corrupt mobster, and he learned that probably from Arthur Finkelstein. The most overwhelming fact of politics is what people do not know. I mean, there's just a lot. The political center has disappeared, and the Republican Party has become the party of the Christian right more so than in any other period in modern history. Bush's victory not only establishes the power of the American Christian right in this candidacy, but in fact established its power to elect the next Republican president. Isn't that true?
Well, ain't that the truth? Trump had more of the Christian evangelical vote than Bush or Reagan, so that's definitely true. And I think if we want to kind of summarize this up, I don't know. I mean, we've kind of gone on a lot of tangents. I think I've enjoyed the conversation here personally, but I think that, if you want to, I'm just really starting to understand this Arthur Finkelstein. I didn't really have an understanding of him. I didn't really know who he was just a few weeks ago, but we always talk about Roy Cohn, right, as kind of being the person who shaped Trump and people like Roger Stone, but Arthur Finkelstein is at least as important than Roy Cohn, perhaps even from a strategic, strictly political perspective, may even be more important in shaping Trump and the movement that surrounds him just from a strictly political perspective. So anytime we talk about Roy Cohn and people like that, I think the name Arthur Finkelstein needs to be given equal attention when it comes to trying to understand what is behind not just Trump, but this entire kind of conservative nationalist Zionist movement that's going on in the U.S. and in Europe, as well as within the right wing in Israel.
Exactly. In many ways, you could see Roy Cohn as he sort of was like the legal mentor in many ways to the Stones and the Trumps, but Arthur Finkelstein was the political mentor, and much more directly actually was involved in the Trump operation itself in 2016. And clearly a lot of his, quote, kids are still deeply involved in all of this. So we will continue to look into this, and maybe in the future we will.
Ari Fleischer, who's not exactly anti-Trump, and his role is largely ignored by a lot of, his support for Trump's largely ignored by a lot of people. So
yeah, and someone like Fleischer is another perfect example of this political network that's primarily focused around the United States. And Ari Fleischer, I pointed out an article before that I believe Christopher Bolin wrote that points out Ari Fleischer's familial relationships, maybe even a brother or something like that, is deeply involved with the actual some of the companies and also the Chabad networks, but the Israeli intelligence networks that are in the background of aspects of the September 11th operation emanating out of Israel. So we'll continue to explore these networks, and maybe in the future we'll go a little more deeply into this Hungary connection and how that might represent the way that a lot of these networks are connected by the Russian Jewish mob syndicate, and what's represented by someone like a Semyon Mogilevich as a potential connector behind the scenes in terms of some of the aspects of the money flow and money interests that are represented by aspects of this sort of above the board political power set represented by the Finkelsteins and his political proteges. So indeed. I guess until later on, Antidote. We out.
All right. Have a good one. All right. Talk to you later, my friend.
Okay. Bye-bye, Greg. Thank you.